Hello and welcome to this Emerging Historians event as part of History Month 2020. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands that we are all living, working and studying on. I am coming to you from the lands of the Bunurong people, and I would like to acknowledge their elders past and present. They are custodians of history for many thousands of years. This event tonight is brought to you by the Professional Historians Association of Victoria and Tasmania and the Royal Historical Society of Victoria. My name is Alicia Soretto and I'm the President of PHA Vic and Tas. Today we are bringing you stories from four of our newest historians, Fiona Gatt, Sulkovska, Harshini Gunadilika and Elizabeth Offa. And I'd like to introduce you to my co-host, Andrew Lemon, former president of the RHSV and proud PHA member, who will begin by talking a little bit about this event and why we do it. Welcome, Andrew.
Well, thanks very much, Alicia. And it's almost historical. This would be the last night of complete lockdown, and this could be a really interesting artifact to be looked back in a few hundred years' time. Let's hope that we're not too quickly back in that position again. But talking to people in Zoom and doing discussions on Zoom has been a very interesting experience for many of us over the last few months. This is an event that the RHSV has been running in several different ways in several years. But I think, Alicia, you came up with a brilliant idea of let's put a bit of speed into this. Let's see what it's like when you've been working on a big topic. Is it a PhD? Is it an MA? Is it a really big essay topic? And how do you do that 5-minute to 8-minute explanation to that really interested person who asks you that question at that party and says, so what do you do? Or what are you working on now? Or what's your next research topic? And suddenly you have to turn that into a very quick presentation that's going to, I suppose, distill what it's all about. So it's a great opportunity, I think, for our emerging historians to do this. I just wondered, Alicia, from your own experience before we launch into the four topics, how do you compare, because you're a terrific presenter in person, presenting on Zoom compared with being in a room at the RHSV? We might have had a couple of drinks, we've all got together. Which do you prefer?
Oh, look, I find it hard to not love the in-person event and that connection. And I think we've had an enormous learning curve in these past few months of finding out, well, how can we feel that connection with the audience, whether as a presenter or even as an audience member, how do we feel connected to the story? And I think we've seen historians in particular, because that's, you know, our area of expertise, watching historians work out how to use Zoom to their advantage. I've heard of presenters using PowerPoint for the first time because they never felt the need to use it, but they feel that it's needed. You need the visual in Zoom. And also I think some advice I've given other people too is to pretend there's someone on the other side of that screen, to imagine your audience, if that's what helps you to feel connected to the people you're talking to.
That's fantastic advice, because really history is all about communication, and some of us are more comfortable doing it in words and on the page. And I think many of us have discovered ways in which we can use the visual material that's so richly available now to augment that. But still there's that personality putting it across. The thing that sometimes with our emerging historians, we've had a couple of emerging historians who were well into their 70s or 80s, so you don't have to be new. But I think that most of our presenters, all of our presenters today, are what I certainly describe as young. So I hope they take that as a compliment. And I think what's really interesting is to get new perspectives on some really old and fascinating subjects. So tonight we're going to be looking at the history of one of my favourite parts of Melbourne, North Melbourne. We're going to be going into the cemeteries and looking at them as not just a source of history, but as an artefact in their own right. and we're going to be looking at a forgotten but fascinating early broadcaster during the Second World War and find out what mysteries were going on in that story. And then we're going to look at the question of religion on the goldfields. And I think that it's a topic that really connects to the conversation that I had last week with the RHSV with Sue Silberberg, who'd written about early Jewish immigrants to Melbourne. So we've got a terrific selection of events, and so at the end of each presentation, I might just say a couple of words, and then I'll throw back to you, Alicia, to introduce the next speaker. And Alicia might give us an idea of how our audience, and welcome to everybody, we've had a fantastic turnout tonight. If you've got a question that you're interested in putting up, there is a Q&A button. So Alicia, take us through that, and then I'll let you introduce our first speaker.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew. It's good to sort of reflect on the event itself before we launch into it with our 4 speakers tonight. So as Andrew said, I'll introduce each speaker. They'll speak for about 8 minutes, and then Andrew will give a little response. Now, if a question comes to you at any time, please feel free to use that menu bar, the Q&A button in the bottom menu bar there, and you can pop a question in. You can choose to be anonymous if you wish, or you can have your name on there too. A note that we are recording this session, and that will be made available to other PHA and RHSV members after the event. If you do have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat button, or if you want to make more of a comment, or particularly to one of our speakers, you can use the chat button for that one. And without further ado, I think we will introduce our first speaker. So welcome to Fiona Gatt. Fiona is a PhD candidate at Deakin University. Her thesis aims to recover the lived experience of 19th century urbanisation on Melbourne's colonial urban frontier, focusing on the town of Hotham, which is now known as the suburb of North Melbourne. Fiona's research delves into the quantitative data of the rate books using urban history techniques, but blended with qualitative insights to achieve a recreative mode of more intimate details of the urbanisation process. So welcome, Fiona, and thank you. Take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the PHA and to RHSV for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share a bit of what I'm working on, which, as you said, is my PhD, which I started in February last year, and the draft title is The Lived Experience of Urbanisation in Hotham, North Melbourne, 1852 to 1905. So my research area is what we now call the suburb of North Melbourne, but for most of the 19th century, it was called the town of Hotham. And I'd like to take a moment to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri, traditional owners of the area, a site where colonial invasion in the form of urbanisation took place. So my work looks at what shaped the community of Hotham in the 19th century, spatially and socially, and how the experience of urbanisation was different for different parts of the community. Rather than give you an overview of the whole project, I'm going to tell you a story about the small world of Oxford Street, and particularly the families that lived in the only 2 houses in the street that were owner occupied during the 19th century. We start our story with William and Mary Melvin, migrants from Scotland who arrived in 1852, the year Hotham began to be developed. Their daughters Maggie and Christina Bell were born there in 1854 and 1859. William worked as a carpenter, and he probably worked on building the 5 small wooden houses he then owned in and off Vale Street. This was a promising start to the young family. In February 1859, however, all five houses were lost to a fire that destroyed some 42 houses. Presumably the Melvins' properties were insured, however, since by 1862 they had recovered and set themselves up in a similar situation in Oxford Street, renting out 4 two-roomed wooden houses next door to their 4-room brick dwelling. Mary and Christina Bell died there in 1867 and William in 1877, and the only surviving member of the family, Maggie, became owner of the 4-roomed brick house and landlady to a cabinet maker, 2 labourers and a Mrs. Whitworth, occupation nil. The annual rateable value of all 5 properties remained constant between 1871 and 1881. To add to her income as landlady, Maggie worked as a dressmaker. Number 5 Oxford Street was soon to become the family home to a 2nd generation, or really a 3rd generation. In 1886, Maggie married Robert Cherry, a porter for the Victorian Railways. In 1891, however, the Cherry family, which had grown to 5, only owned and lived in the brick house, and Alexander now owned the 4 wooden houses. By 1895, their value had dropped to £6 each and had changed hands again. These houses, however, now 40 years old and having been built in haste during the gold rush years, were not a sound investment. In August 1896, Watson and Kay, reported to be 2 of the worst prostitutes in Melbourne, were charged with being the occupier of a disorderly house in Oxford Street. As there were no window panes to the house, a constable reported in court, passers-by could witness all the proceedings. Others were charged with frequenting the houses when they had no visible means of support. By 1901, the 4 wooden houses, once the respectable investment of William Melvin, had become land and ruins. Oxford Street had 22 dwellings in 1895, but by 1901, this had been reduced to 11, the ravages of time on old buildings with no foundations having taken their toll. Robert and Maggie still lived in the brick house where she had lived since she was a child. Their young children, aged between 5 and 12 in 1901, grew up in this rapidly degenerating street. For Robert and Maggie, however, it was probably not a financial possibility to move, since they would have been unlikely to obtain a good price for their house, given the overall state of the street. The renters in Oxford Street always changed, but one other owner-occupied family stayed in the street for decades. Thomas Hassett, a labourer, owned number 3, a 3-room wooden house next door to the Cherries. The annual rateable value of that house dropped from £15 in 1881 to £8 by 1901. In 1889, when Thomas died, his wife Margaret continued to live in the house with their 4 surviving sons. If neighbours Maggie and Margaret had been friends, it would have been a relationship marked by the difficult life of the Hassett family. The Hassett family children were born earlier in the century than the Cherries, and as they sought to enter the workforce during the trying time of the 1890s Depression years, living in the decaying Oxford Street, hopelessness, restlessness, and even desperation may have accounted for much of their troubles with the law. During the 1880s and 1890s, the brothers between them worked up an impressive list of minor criminal convictions, all of them very local to Oxford Street. William, aged 14, drunk and conducting himself in a disgraceful manner. Aged 17, stole a case of wine from a cart. Vagrancy. Patrick, charged with throwing a stone and enticing a dog to worry a cow. Acquitted on a charge of stealing lead from a house. Vagrancy. Inciting a prisoner to resist. Stealing a horse and cart and its load of vegetables. Insulting behaviour. Being well known to police in North Melbourne was a constant mark on the brothers' lives. In January 1891, John was arrested and again charged with vagrancy. In the North Melbourne Police Court, he had been fairly arrested. No doubt the police thought it was time he was put in again, and so arrested him and swore he was no good, reported The Age. I've chosen to tell you this story about the Melvin, Cherries and Hassetts because it's an example of the microhistory I've been able to garner from the records that can tell us so much about how and why Hotham's reputation changed over the 19th century. from a place where working class families could realise home ownership in mid-century to a dangerous and unruly problem area by the end of the century. During the Victorian age, the ideal of the owner-occupied family home rose to prominence as the achievement of respectable men, the bastion of moral life, and the concept was eagerly promoted by the land and building boom of 1880s marvellous Melbourne. In this story, though, we can see this contrast with the experience of colonists who became owner-occupiers earlier in the century, in small homes built in the flurry of the gold rush with no building regulations. What this story tells us is that in these circumstances, home ownership did not provide a moral sanctum, but rather a binding tie to a hopeless street and town life marked by reputation and a cycle of localised petty crime. The fault lines that became clear in the 1890s in families like the Hassetts were already on show in the 1880s, and in fact can in part be traced back to the 1850s and the decision to develop the area with no Building Act. Thank you very much for listening and for allowing me to share this with you.
Fantastic, and thank you very much, Fiona. As somebody who's probably started doing my own historical research in local history, there's that wonderful dynamic between the generalisation, the need to get the overview, and suddenly it comes alive when you actually get into the lives of the people. So I think that's really interesting in what you're doing there. And if we have a little bit of a chance at the end, we might talk a little bit about the sorts of sources that you're using and the joys and frustrations of doing that. But the other thing that really comes through from your presentation tonight is that it's really important for us to go past the generalisation that we make about a particular area, because you're showing us that even within a space of a few years in colonial Melbourne, North Melbourne is beginning to change. And then I wonder about the dynamics of that expansion of North Melbourne into what was beautifully called on your map wastelands. And so that's another chapter, and of course down towards the gasometer. So it really raises lots of wonderful ideas and thoughts there. So now we'll get Alicia to move on to our second presentation, but thank you very much, Fiona.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to Fiona. I'm sort of just always left wanting to know more.
Yeah.
So our second presenter tonight is Lee Sulkovska. Lee is a first-year PhD candidate at Deakin University, having completed her honours thesis just last year in 2019, although it feels longer ago, I'm sure. Lee's research explores historical cemeteries as cultural vehicles and suggests that the history of burial spaces in Australia offers post-colonial insights. Lee, I'm rapt to hear from you. Over to you.
Thanks, Alicia. Okay, just share my screen. So hello, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. I would like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people on whose land I'm speaking to you tonight. I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I acknowledge that the First Nations people of Australia have maintained deep history through an oral tradition that has lasted millennia, and their land has never been ceded. I'd also like to thank the Professional Historians Association of Victoria and Tasmania, and also the Royal Historical Society of Victoria for organising this Emerging Historians event and inviting me to speak to you all. So, my thesis begins in 19th century Britain, where the Industrial Revolution has caused a population boom and driven most of that population into the cities in search of work. However, the living conditions are poor and the mortality rate soars 40% higher in urban centres compared to the rural areas. So demand for burial space is high. However, up until now, the primary mode of interment has been local churchyards, which are small and already full of the dead from previous centuries of platoon. They were so gross and overcrowded that the soil in churchyards were often several feet higher than the street around it because of coffins being stacked one on top of the other. And historian James Stevens Curl says that the earth was constantly being disturbed and a black, evil-smelling slime covered surfaces of the soil. So Britain needed a better burial solution. Thinkers and writers like John Claudius Loudon, John Strang, and George Alfred Walker wrote treatises proposing that Britain emulate France's first garden cemetery, Père Lachaise. Garden cemeteries were burial grounds located outside of urban centres and were characterised by winding walks, shading trees, and luscious flowers. The burial reformists argued that garden cemeteries were not only to improve the hygiene in the cities, but they would also serve as an improving moralising force. These spaces were designed to encourage people to spend time in them, to consider kind feelings towards their fellow man, to ponder over the meaning of life, and to consider memento mori, or remember that you will die. This thinking caught on, and garden cemeteries popped up everywhere in Britain, the most famous of which are London's Magnificent Seven. But what of the Australian colonies, you ask? Certainly, whatever Britain does, Australia must do better, right? Just kidding. But the garden cemetery movement did catch on in Australia, and you can still see examples of garden cemeteries in places like Rookwood in Sydney, Burundara in Melbourne, Western Terrace in Adelaide, Cornelian Bay in Hobart, and Karrakatta in Perth, among many others. However, the lofty ideals put forward by the burial reformists about how cemeteries should look, what they should represent, and the values attached to them didn't always meet the mark, both in Britain and Australia. The reality was that the people and organisations who made these spaces and the communities that used them often had different motivations and ideas. And in Australia, the business of colonisation often limited space, resources, and organisation. These realities changed the value systems attached to colonial Australian cemeteries. And in my honours thesis, I explored this reality in the context of St Kilda Cemetery, another wonderful garden cemetery. So my PhD is a broadening of this exploration, and I'm going to be exploring values attached to cemeteries in Victoria, such as St Kilda, Melbourne General, Burundara, Brighton, Bendigo, Ballarat, and some others. That's a lot of Bs. There's an excellent Oscar Wilde quote in Lady Windermere's Fan. "Gossip is charming. History is merely gossip, but scandal is gossip made tedious by morality." And this is where my research lies, in examining the value systems attached to scandals that took place in cemetery spaces. My thesis suggests that through the analysis of the language used in the reporting of cemetery scandals, we'll be able to better understand the value systems of Australian colonists in the 19th century. So I'm still very early on in the very first year of my PhD, so I have a long way to go before I reach any kind of conclusions, but my honours thesis can give us a tantalising teaser. There was a number of interesting happenings in St Kilda Cemetery. There was an infestation of rabbits. There was men spitting tobacco juice at the ladies. There was theft. There was vandalism, embezzlement. There was the illegal transferring of grave rights, and even accusations of grave stacking and body burning. In discussing scandals, historian Kirsten McKenzie writes that when behaviour elicits a violent reaction that seems out of proportion to the original offence, we can be sure that it's touching a collective nerve. Forces deeper than just superficial transgression are at work. And this is true of the way scandals were reported in St Kilda Cemetery. Words like unholy, demoniacal, humanity, barbarism, heathen, and civilization suggest that the colonists felt something far deeper than just outrage at a mere infestation of rabbits. I suspect that they were preoccupied with the binaries of civilization and savagery, of propriety and good behaviour. One gentleman wrote in complaint to the loitering of young people, "Surely the trustees have the power to prevent this demoniacal horde from occupying the principal approaches to the cemetery, or from using as a resting place the low wall which encloses the ground, thereby forcing the general public to take the road in order to avoid this sacrilegious class." And a disgraced ex-secretary at the heart of another scandal, also used interesting language in a letter he wrote defending himself. "I was made no secret of the fact that I was transferring graves. As for bones being taken up and burned, this is an abominable and wicked lie." You'll notice, I'm sure, the use of words such as demoniacal, sacrilegious, abominable, and wicked. There's a lot to unpack in these examples, and I'm excited to explore further how class, gender, race, dispossession, and colonization jostled for attention in the colonists' lives, and how they translated their living behavior to dead spaces. Thanks for listening.
That is going to give you an awful lot of entertainment and anxiety before you finish that PhD, Lee, but and I'll be really interested to discover, perhaps at the end of our discussion, what was the inspiration, which cemetery got you going, because I think cemeteries have a lot to answer for with historians. It's a place where you wander through and you suddenly start realizing that there are stories and short stories and tragic stories and cultural expressions that are there. So my credentials on cemeteries are a history of the Williamstown Cemetery, written many years ago and updated more recently by Helen Doyle. But I just remember finding what an extraordinary insight that was into that community, as well as into the practices and the ideas. And your thesis will mean that you're one of the few people who can pronounce demoniacal. That takes a bit of doing. So let's come back and talk about some of the really interesting things that have come out of that. But again, it's what we're starting to see here is a little bit of a connection between the big picture, the big cemetery, and then the small stories, the individual stories that are sitting there on the tombstones and on the forgotten graves and the politics behind it. So I think that you will have a lot of adventures on this PhD. So thank you very much, Lee.
Thanks, Andrew.
And Alicia, on with round 3. We're going really well. Everybody's fantastically disciplined. Let's see how we go with round 3.
Very good. And I think, Andrew's mentioned his work on cemeteries and Helen Doyle, and there are other historians, certainly within the PHA and even in the Q&A coming through, offering their insights into cemeteries for Lee. So making lots of connections.
Great.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. So our third speaker for tonight is Harshini Gunadilika, and she has just completed her Master of Cultural Heritage at Deakin University. In 2018, at the University of Melbourne, Harshini wrote her honours thesis, which explored the life of forgotten British journalist and radio broadcaster Alan Bell and his contribution to the Allied war effort in Australia. A short piece about her research has been published by the University of Melbourne Archives, and she is incredibly excited to be presenting to all of us tonight. And we are very pleased to have you. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'll just share my screen. Okay, and thank you to the PHA and the RHSV for the opportunity to speak tonight. I would like to begin by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of any other communities that may be present here today. So, hello everyone. I am incredibly excited to introduce all of you to Alan Bell, a largely forgotten but incredibly fascinating figure in British Australian radio and wartime history. Bell's story was one I stumbled across while pouring through transcripts of his nightly talks, which aired on Melbourne radio station 3DB from 1942 to 1944. These transcripts provided insight into two histories, One, which was about Australia's tense relationship with Britain during the Second World War, and another about Alan Bell's deeply intriguing journey to Australia, where he would live until his passing. While these stories are by no means separate, tonight I would like to focus mainly on this second story, talking about who Alan Bell was, how I came to unearth more about his past, and what we can learn by examining his time in Australia during the Second World War. So, who was Alan Bell? In short, he was a very well-known English journalist and radio broadcaster planted in Melbourne by the British government to ensure that Australians continued to support the war effort in Europe. Bell's task was to remind his listeners that while Britain was devoting their energy to defeating what he called the German Goliath, their hearts and their minds were with their Australian family facing the threat of the Japanese in the Pacific. Bell arrived in Australia in May 1942 and quickly became a popular radio personality. His broadcast gathered a regular audience from around Australia, and he was noted for presenting the sixth most popular feature in the Melbourne area. While at times he was criticised for being too pro-British by the Australian government to the extent that he was almost transported back to England, Bell's final broadcast on 14 September 1944 prompted an avalanche of letters from listeners expressing their appreciation of his nightly talks. Prior to his secondment to Australia, Bell had certainly made a name for himself back home in England. He had amassed a considerable number of professional connections and had been noted for his skills as a reporter. He worked for prominent contemporary papers such as the London Morning Post, the Daily Mail, and the British Gazette. In 1940, Bell took on his final role in England as the Empire News Observer for the BBC, where he was tasked with rallying support for the Allied nations, particularly from the United States, as well as from dominions of the British Empire. Bell remained in this post for 2 years until his notable professional connections came knocking and thrust him further into the world of British propaganda. So these connections are a hugely important part of Bell's story. It was one of the things that intrigued me the most about my research because everywhere I looked, I found that Bell's life was replete with friends in high places. I discovered that Bell was the godson of imperialist Cecil Rhodes. I also discovered that he worked closely with and was heavily praised for his writing by the founder of the Daily Mail, the first Viscount Rothermere Harold Harmsworth. However, the most significant outcome of my thesis, and by far the most exciting, is that I was able to substantiate Bell's connection to three very important individuals. They were media magnate Sir Keith Murdoch, who owned Radio 3DB in Melbourne, Brendan Bracken, the British Minister for Information, and close personal friend of Bell's most notable connection, Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill. Bell had developed a professional relationship with Churchill early on in his journalistic career. Their first interaction took place in 1926, when Bell, at the young age of 27, worked alongside Churchill at the British Gazette as assistant news editor. In his first broadcast to his Australian listeners, Bell recounted this time in his life incredibly fondly, describing Churchill as the great and famous editor that he had the honour of working with. Bell's personal admiration for Churchill was also just as significant, as for him, England and Empire owed its survival to their Prime Minister. Much to Bell's delight, his work as a journalist allowed him to interact with Churchill on a number of occasions, whether it was running into Churchill in the offices of the Morning Post, or when in 1934 he interviewed Churchill at his home in Chartwell to discuss the looming German threat that would manifest 5 years later. I found this relationship between Churchill and Bell to be completely fascinating, and as such, it occupied a majority of my research. This led me to contact the BBC archives in Caversham, the Daily Telegraph archives in London, and the Churchill archives in Cambridge. The BBC archives was by far the most fruitful source of information, as I was given access to internal correspondence that connected Bell to Murdoch and Churchill. In a telegram to a Mr. Chesterton, which is the one you see before you on the screen, dated 23rd February 1942, Bell stated, "I should not be going to Australia, and had the Minister of Information and Sir Keith Murdoch not convinced me that there is a very useful job to be done." Knowing that the Minister for Information was also Churchill's close friend, and that Bell had worked closely with Churchill on a number of occasions, I could, with great certainty, connect Bell's transfer to Australia directly to Churchill. I was also able to confirm this information by looking a little closer to home. To my great surprise, the two people who knew Alan Bell closely were in Melbourne all along. They are Dr. Howard Goldenberg and Associate Professor Christopher Cordner of the University of Melbourne. Dr. Goldenberg painted a vivid picture of Bell, describing him as a highly educated man of beautiful elocution and good taste, who was chosen by Churchill to be his man in Australia. Dr. Goldenberg was also kind enough to introduce me to Professor Cordner, who had known Alan Bell closely while growing up. He described Bell as a sharp, witty, and highly articulate man who spoke and wrote beautifully. He stated that Bell loved the British Empire fervently and suspected that Bell moved to Australia so that he would not have to see it crumble. Professor Cordner was also generous enough to allow me access to a collection of Alan Bell's personal artifacts that provided invaluable insight into Bell's life in England. I'm incredibly grateful to both Dr. Goldenberg and Professor Cordner for their help. So just briefly, this is me very excitedly holding a picture of Alan Bell's cover on South Australia Radio Call magazine. And this was in the collection of artifacts that Professor Cordner so kindly gave me to look through. And it's a very good indication of Bell's popularity at the time and was really valuable for my research. So just before I wrap up, I wanted to discuss very quickly why I think Bell's story is one worth telling. You might be thinking, well, why is he such an important figure? Well, it's because I believe that Bell's journey to Australia and his broadcasts reveal a lot about Australia's relationship with Britain during the Second World War. After Singapore fell to the Japanese in February 1942, Australians were deeply concerned that Britain would abandon them to Japanese invasion as well. What we see reflected in Bell's broadcasts are Britain's efforts to convince Australians that this would not be the case, with Bell stating repeatedly that the defence of Australia is thought of by the people of Britain as vital. The urgency of delivering this message is also reflected in the process of Bell's secondment and the speed with which it took place, as 4 months after being approached by Murdoch, he was then arriving in Australia. I think that this speaks volumes about Britain's concern that they were losing faith of the Australian people and their influence over their dominion. However, it also reflects a great deal about Bell's own journalistic talents, seeing as he was hand-chosen by Churchill to complete this very important task on behalf of Britain and Empire. For these reasons, I think it's so important that Bell's contribution to the war effort on both Australian and English soil is recognised. The role that he played in the war undoubtedly deserves attention from our radio and wartime histories, and I'm certain that by examining Bell's journey to Australia and his work in England, we can learn a great deal more about the relationship between the two countries. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow, that is, I think there's a spy movie coming up in all of that, actually. I think there's, look, with the first picture you had of him immediately made me think of, I don't know if anybody used to watch that terrific BBC series about current affairs TV called The Hour. And there's a character in that played by Ben Wishart, and it suddenly made me think, this is the young man who is really in this adventure of being in this world. And so I think you have a fantastic story there, and one that is really worth exploring for all sorts of reasons. I was familiar with him only to a very minor extent, but I knew that I was aware that he was very much in that strong stable of the 3DB, the Herald, and which is a self-supporting kind of publicity organisation, but he was always regarded with some distaste by the Catholic press. And I think it'd be really interesting to sort of see what's going on there. They didn't really like what he said, and I do recall at one stage there was a thought that some of his pro-British material was anti-Catholic. So there's a whole lot of interesting layers there that could be explored. But I also think that there's a lot of work to be done by historians, and is it possible to do it, to unravel the kind of the things that are going on behind the media. We tend to, historians, we use newspapers so much as a primary source, and radio broadcasts less so because of the difficulty of finding them recorded and so on. But certainly in work that I've done on the history of racing and gambling, I've understood increasingly how much commercial motives were behind many of the racing publications and racing broadcasts, and similarly there are all sorts of agendas behind the popular press. So I think you've really opened up what should be a really fascinating area of further research, and to have made that connection with the fact that he continued his life in Australia. There's some really fascinating material there. So well done on that presentation, and you've whetted our appetite for sure.
Thank you.
So Alicia, we're doing fantastically well. Everybody's emerging historians are so much more disciplined than old-fashioned historians. So I'm going to get you to introduce our fourth speaker.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Harshini. That was wonderful. Our fourth speaker is Elizabeth Offa. Elizabeth is currently completing a Doctor of Philosophy in History at La Trobe University in Victoria. Her research is part of a larger community-based project which aims to uncover the religious diversity of the central Victorian goldfields. Elizabeth's research examines the connection between a British identity and the shifting religious practices and worship of the Jewish communities which formed in Bendigo and Ballarat between 1851 and 1900. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'll just put up my slides.
Wonderful.
There we go. So hello, everyone. My presentation is a little bit shorter, but that's all right. So before we begin, I would just like to pay my respects to the original custodians of the land where the Bundoora and the Bendigo La Trobe campuses are located, to the Wurundjeri and the Djadjawanga, as well as to the traditional owners where others are located this evening, and to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. So my name is Elizabeth Offa, and I'm a fourth year history PhD student at La Trobe University, which means I'm currently in the more agonising stages of writing and editing, but with the end in sight. So the research that I'm currently undertaking is part of a larger community-based project that aims to uncover the religious diversity of the Central Victorian goldfields from 1851 to the present. My thesis in particular focuses on the Jewish communities and Hebrew congregations that formed on the Central Victorian goldfields between 1851 and 1900. I am not Jewish myself. I do not identify with Judaism religiously nor culturally, so it was really a community and a faith who I knew quite little about. However, I was well aware of their long history in Australia, as they were a community that I encountered frequently in my honours thesis. And most importantly, they were a community and faith that I really wanted to learn more about. A Jewish presence has been in Australia since the First Fleet, yet this community would really blossom in the 19th century through free settlers and, more significantly, through the gold rushes. The huge wave of incoming migration into the fledgling colony of Victoria significantly boosted the small Jewish community present, many of whom followed gold further inland to Bendigo and Ballarat, where important Hebrew congregations were established in the very earliest years of the goldfields. Most Jewish migrants on the Central Victorian goldfields were born either in Britain, mainly England, or in Eastern or Central Europe, in places such as Poland, or frequently they often put down Prussia. These Jewish settlers were arriving from communities that were experiencing important changes, shifts that would further develop and form as they established Judaic institutions, lives and families on the goldfields. My thesis focuses on these changes, examining the religious, social and cultural adaptations that resulted as Jews developed colonial identities as Anglo and British, through which they defined their belonging to the local, the colonial and the imperial. Class and Victorian notions of the gentile came to be an anxious and negotiated concern for the Jewish community and for the Hebrew congregations as they sought to define and perform their place and belonging to colonial society, which at times meant distancing themselves from the Irish Catholics. As these communities comprised mainly of small businessmen and skilled manual work, the occupational position of the community may have helped to increase the desire to confirm their middle-class status. Across the second half of the 19th century, Jewish communities and Hebrew congregations, as did many other Jewish communities elsewhere, were adapting their synagogue worship, altering ideals concerning women and children, and even how they engaged with the British Empire and international networks, as they responded to both the felt desires and the need to perform a settler identity. In the synagogue space, Goldfield Jews aimed to establish a sense of decorum, a specifically middle-class notion, by introducing choirs, by the frequent use of English instead of Hebrew, which is the language of prayer within Judaism, and by dressing Jewish ministers in certain styles of clothing that were similar to those of the Christian clergy. Victorian domestic femininity fused with traditional Judaic concepts to enable for new roles to become available to Jewish women, allowing them to sing in synagogues, whereas previously their voices were prohibited, and as well as providing the opportunity for them to gain access to the Judaic religious knowledge required for them to become religious teachers, knowledge that they were excluded from previously. For children, British childhood ideals were mediated with Judaic ideas on adult maturity, complicating the place of Judaic coming-of-age rites such as the bar mitzvah, while colonial law significantly altered the place of Judaic institutions aimed at children, such as the Hebrew schools, which were radically altered once the Free and Secular Education Act of 1872 was brought in. In the imperial and international realm, Goldfield's Jews joined societies such as the Anglo-Jewish Association, an international group that sought to aid distressed Jews overseas, while also celebrating royal imperial events for the British monarchy. Both of these aspects of international activity incidentally further contributed towards legitimising the British Empire as places of liberty and freedom, and strengthened the imperial ties of colonial Jews. The shifts and changes that occurred in the Goldfields Jewish communities and Hebrew congregations were deeply connected to the developing identifications of Jews who mediated between the traditional Judaic faith and their sense of Britishness, between their belonging to colonial middle-class society and to the emerging sense of an international Judaic community. The colonial Jewish community, small though it was, were a significant segment of society who made important economic and social contributions to Victorian society. By uncovering their histories, their narratives, their pasts, we can come to better understand the development of modern identities and the importance of religion to this process. I hope my thesis, as well as the articles I have produced, demonstrates how invaluable Jewish history is. As I work to uncover more about the community, of the lives of Jewish men and women in the Australian colonies, I hope to help expand this history and to share it with a wider audience in the coming decades. I am in particular interested in cultural, social, and religious histories, with narratives of women and children holding a particular place in my historian's heart. So thank you for listening, and I'm always happy to talk history and share, so please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions.
Again, a really lovely presentation. I think your pictures are just wonderful. That is something that really does come up well in a Zoom format, because we can really get into those photos. And I think that the digital technology is allowing us to get into images in a way that perhaps wasn't possible just a few years ago. And I think also thinking from what you're talking about, that it's a really good for all of us as historians to go through that exercise of getting into the minds of communities that are not necessarily our immediate communities. We sort of have our own fascination for trying to unravel our own past and our own stories and so on, but then to get into the mindset to say, now I want to discover what it's like to be a Presbyterian, a Methodist, a Jehovah's Witness. To get into a different mindset is really important, and I think we also have to do that as historians in terms of time and place. We have to learn to understand what it was like to be somebody in the 1890s. Is that a different creature from who we are today, and in what ways? Terrific presentation by all of you, and I think each of you has shown us how you can whet our appetite to get into that. Firstly, just making the contrast between you and Lee, you're at the end of that tightrope of walking the PhD. There's never a good spot to be when you're doing a PhD, really, is there? Because it's always scary at whatever spot you're at. But hang in there, and it's not too far away. And the thing is, now you are now the expert. You know so much more about this than anybody else. But I was really interested in that connection between that conversation I had with Sue Silverberg, because her work, she said explicitly, I haven't done much about the rural areas. I haven't done much about Sandhurst, Bendigo and Ballarat, Geelong. So I think that the interconnection between those stories is going to be a really interesting one. We're going to sort of now open up a little bit to a little bit of a discussion, and there are some questions that have come through. But I thought, first of all, if each of you who's presented can now return to our screens by putting your video on, that'd be great. And I just wanted to touch on sources. And before I field a couple of these questions that come, I'm always interested in source material and where you have to go and the difficulties of finding it. So Elizabeth, where have you found you've had to delve to get most of your best source material?
Well, this is a little bit of trouble for me, because the Bendigo and Ballarat Jewish communities didn't have an established archival source. So it wasn't all, gathered together in sort of one area that I could go to and examine. So I really had to draw in material from various different places and really expand the value that we give to, traditional sources, to include, more modern things such as, digitized newspapers and whatnot as well. So the sources I mainly used were newspapers, because, like I said, there's not really much in the way of archival sources. A lot of it has been misplaced or lost. Mm-hmm. So I relied mainly on newspapers, which included area-specific newspapers like the Ballarat Star, as well as a Jewish newspaper that was edited in Melbourne, actually, from about the 1880s as well, which had, community reports. I also used things such as diaries, just sort of more traditional sort of things. I did have to do a little bit more investigation, because often when this material is catalogued, it's just that person's name and not things, like their religion. So I often have to do a little bit of extra digging around to see who they were.
I do recall Sue saying in her presentation that one of the challenges is, of course, identifying or separating out individuals who, like all historical subjects, will keep repeating names and so on. So
yes.
Family history can sometimes help you unravel some of those, but I'm sure it's been a very complicated process. I noticed and I'll get Harshini to turn on her microphone, because I noticed, Harshini, in yours that you had material from the BBC archives. Is that digitised and online, or did you have to get on a sailing boat and go to England?
I did have to. I didn't go there. I would have loved to, but I had to email. I had to email them in, and they were a bit hesitant to give me some of the information. I think because some of it was still, they weren't allowed to digitize it. But I was lucky that the information that they did give me was the perfect amount of information that I needed. So I'd be fascinated to go there and see what else they have in the collection.
Yes, and find more. And was there a Eureka moment in your research where you discovered something that you just never imagined you were going to find?
Well, it was sort of touch and go, because I had, of course, the honourable word of Dr. Goldenberg and Professor Cordner that Bell was Churchill's man in Australia, but I wanted something on paper that showed that as well. And I think it was maybe like a week before my thesis was due, and I was sitting, and I must have missed the name Brendan Bracken, who was the Minister of Information, in the telegram, and then all of a sudden I was pouring through it again because I knew it had to be in there somewhere, and there it was. And then I knew that, yes, okay, we could the connection.
That's very recognisable. I think that sort of suddenly realising that there's a linkage there that you've really made. And talking now to Lee. Lee, your microphone's muted too, so I'll get you to come on board. Talking about this question of, was there a cemetery which first got you going, or are you just a cemetery buff?
Yes, there was one cemetery. I used to live in Scotland, and I volunteered with a friends group that was taking care of an overgrown and abandoned cemetery called Warriston. And it was a beautiful garden cemetery. I knew nothing about its history or what it meant, and I sort of fell in love with the group, and I fell in love with the space. And when I came back to Australia, it kind of went from there.
Yeah, and Australian cemeteries can look, I mean, some of them are sort of laid out looking like hospital wards. And I think about 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to be in Toronto at this time of year. And we were asking where were the best places to go and see the fall leaves, the autumn colours of Toronto. And they said, go to the cemetery. And it was fascinating as a garden cemetery, seeing this sort of a combination of the American style cemeteries with what I'd see as the British influence. But Australian cemeteries are quite austere on the whole, although their setting, like Walhalla or even Queenstown Cemetery, some of those country cemeteries, the setting is amazing, and yet the layout, it's so we're very much, we have a pattern that was imposed on the way Australian cemeteries had to work.
I think it was more style influences that sort of came over from Britain, and we interpreted it, the best we could. The big beautiful ones like Melbourne General and Kew, they're more adhering to the garden cemetery style as laid out by the burial reformists, but space, time, resources all kind of influenced how even the smaller cemeteries like St Kilda, and very much so the remote ones, were laid out.
They didn't always stop and think about what the ground was like underneath when they did some cemeteries are pretty tough work. So I really think you've picked a really fascinating topic. And Fiona, just going to you, there you are. I mentioned that extension of North Melbourne and that arrival of things like the football club and that part of North Melbourne. That's really, as it were, North Melbourne or Hotham expanding, isn't it? It's a different part of.
It did expand after the 1870s. That's when the land was actually sold off after Hotham became its own town. It was always intended to be part of that town, but they developed the municipality before even half of the land was developed, which in itself is quite fascinating and worth looking into. Yeah.
Does the arrival of the football club sort of have any kind of galvanising effect of creating local loyalties in a way that maybe wasn't there beforehand? Or
I wouldn't say that it wasn't there beforehand, but perhaps it involved other people who weren't included in those other ways previously, which was more sort of the middle class set, and the shop owners. They had a more public role initially in the town's identity, but the North Melbourne Football Club at times was perhaps not a good reputation as well. There were some fights and rows and hooliganism and things. Yeah.
it is such an interesting area because there's that kind of posh end of North Melbourne, you know, up near Errol Street and the Town Hall, and where you can see it's a lot of civic pride.
Yes.
And there's this other life of the workers who are very close to Melbourne and working in there. So I find that a really interesting part of Melbourne. So thanks everybody for that. Alicia, a number of questions have come in. Would you like to see if there's a couple you'd like to throw at a couple of our speakers?
Let's do it. And I have to say that some of your responses and the conversation so far reminds me that last year we talked about that theme of breakthrough, and then we talked about that idea of serendipity. What's the luck? You know, what's that? The fact that you saw that name, Harshini, when you had a week to go, how amazing, and sort of thinking about those connections, what has drawn you to find those individuals and then be able to put it into your bigger picture. So I've enjoyed those little bits too tonight. A specific question here for Elizabeth, talking about how do you feel that the exposure to other religious identities on the goldfields might have affected the shift in gender roles within Jewish practices?
That's a good question. I've done a little bit of research in one of my chapters in this as well. We don't really have too much in the way of maybe in the domestic space, which is really where traditional gender roles stand out most for Jewish women, with things like, you know, kitchen practices and kosher and whatnot as well. But we can see in sort of more the public spaces of, say, the synagogue, their roles within these spaces are really changing as the community is adopting, you know, certain religious practices, which they themselves acknowledge, you know, that this is a Christian practice, you know, these choirs, you know, this is what Christians do as well. So, which traditionally women's voices were prohibited within the synagogue space because it was deemed as being distracting. And we can see, you know, in these Goldfields Jewish communities that, you know, women were becoming part of choirs that we introduced, you know, doing things like solos. So there were times when women's voices were the only voice being heard in the synagogue. And things as well, such as decorating opens up as a course for them to engage with the synagogue space, which connects to domestic ideals, which place, you know, women as being these fantastic decorators, you know, and they beautify the home. But we can also see that the adoption of these sort of Victorian domestic ideals really shift the dialogues that surround Jewish women at this time. You know, there's this idea coming up that you see that, you know, women are the most fertile soil for religion and that they're naturally religious, whereas traditionally in sort of Judaism, men are traditionally prescribed the most sort of religious practices and religious roles, which is not to discount the value that's placed on Jewish women in the home. It's just that they have less of a public role within these faiths as well, which we really see shifting as they adopt more sort of Christian practices and those Victorian domestic ideals, which sort of transgress all religions.
If I can jump in at that point also, just it's really interesting to see that those kind of initiatives had the effect, and perhaps it was the intention to make Judaism less different from the other religions. In other words, to say, you don't have to be suspicious of us because we're religious, but we do it in a slightly different way, but we still arrange the flowers and we still sing and we still have our services in English. And so you don't have to be as alarmed by us. We're not fundamentalist. And so there's that sort of liberalism that's coming through it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when you realize that there were a number of Christian people who were attending these services. Often they were going for special occasions, or if there's, you know, Jubilee events to celebrate Queen Victoria, very often Christian people and Christian clergy were going as well. So for them to go and sort of see these practices and go, oh, you know, this is similar to what we do as well, it acts as a moment of sort of bridging communities through shared practice.
Thanks. Alicia?
Wonderful. So this one's for Lee, and the question comes from someone with an archaeological background. So they're interested to know, of course, grave stacking and body burning. This person is saying, you know, archaeologically, it's been practiced by numerous cultures. So what makes it so scandalous and what have you found in your research?
Absolutely. Great question. And I actually think I know who this is.
Anonymous, we found out.
Well, they're absolutely correct. And even in Britain, the history reflects that bodies prior to sort of Henry VIII were regularly sort of taken out of the burial ground and put into charnel houses. You know, go back even further and you've got burning of bodies, but it was really around the time of Henry VIII. And when he split from the Catholic Church and the rise of Protestantism sort of became popular, that the tenets of it were that the grave was to be in perpetuity and just the one. And this was very much reinforced in the burial reformist literature, especially someone like John Claudius Loudon. In his treatise, he said that explicitly a garden cemetery should have one burial in perpetuity. So when you've got cemeteries in Australia who have kind of taken that ideal from Britain, they've reflected that in their rules and regulations within the cemetery guidelines. And you see that in the primary sources, it very much states as a rule, you know, the owner of the plot will have it in perpetuity and should only have, you know, one person in a hole. And so when you've got people taking them out or stacking them, it's a little bit scandalous. Not unheard of, but it's just a little bit sort of hush hush, and we shouldn't be doing that, and oh, scandal.
And you start to get I suppose, Victorian attitudes of decorum, of what's right and what's wrong, what's proper, coming into that discussion as well. So but on the other hand, you're dealing with a pioneering society, and it's really interesting in the early cemeteries that there's often a pragmatism that is where people are buried, and then later on there's a tidying up process. Lee, do you think that your research will take you into that into the 20th century, into the crematoriums and all of that, or are we going to stay safely in that dangerous 19th century?
I'm going to try and stick pretty solely to the 1800s, purely because there's just too much.
There is too many people. Yeah. We've had some terrific feedback from people watching this webinar, haven't we, Alicia? And everybody's been really impressed by the panelists and what they've had to say. I wanted to know if any of the panelists had questions they wanted to ask of any of the other panelists. And before we start moving towards winding up our event, anybody amongst you four who've suddenly thought, I must ask that question? It's worth asking.
I do have a question for Lee, actually. I've only done a little bit of reading into sort of parks, but for what my understanding is that, you know, sort of the mid to late 19th century, you sort of get the public park coming up as sorts of, you know, places of public leisure where people go and they walk, and, you know, there are certain limits set on what you can and can't do, but, you know, children sort of ignore them and they jump over the, you know, the railings and they do as they like. So I was wondering how that sort of compares with that sort of public park with the cemetery park, where, you know, on the one hand, you've got a park coming up where it's leisure and sort of maybe a bit more sort of that casual where you can go and walk, you can go and meet people, compared to sort of the cemetery where there's more, seems to be more rigid about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and, you know, how perhaps those practices in the public park can't be translated to the cemetery park.
Great question, Elizabeth. And cemeteries, especially garden cemeteries, were treated like public parks, and oftentimes that was really the only space nearby for people to go, especially in Britain. Those green spaces were hard to come by. And so people treated it like a leisure park, and it was encouraged to do so. But of course, there were rules around, what was expected in terms of behaviour. There were, no spitting, no swearing. John Claudius Loudon even suggested in his treatise that you shouldn't be singing or laughing, no fun allowed. But yeah, it was often, they were sort of used interchangeably, but there was still those sort of Victorian class rules around, what was appropriate behaviour in either space. And sometimes they were separate and sometimes they overlapped.
There's also a rich vein for you to discover in inscriptions on cemeteries. And my favourite one from Williamstown, it was a piece of doggerel, because sometimes people would put a bit of poetry there, and it was usually pretty sentimental and sad. But I can't remember the first two lines of it, but it was one of those ones that went, beneath this stone, somebody or other lies. But the last two lines were where he goes and how he fares, no one knows and no one cares. So that was a bit tough. I don't know if it was his joke or not, but Alicia, as we're moving towards the closing time of this terrific seminar, I would like to certainly thank the people behind the screen who are not there to speak to you, but Michelle Bashter and Kimberly Ma, who've been behind the scenes and making it all happen. Alicia, for getting the PHA to keep doing their fantastic programs. Rosemary Cameron, our Executive Director at the RHSV. I think it's these sorts of things have kept us almost sane over the last little while, and maybe some of us more productive than we might have expected to be. Alicia, a last word from you. She's muted.
Wow.
There you are.
You'd think I was brand new. Thanks to each of you for such passion and enthusiasm for your topics. We have really appreciated and are so glad that you all said yes to coming along and doing this. I think it's been wonderful for the audience, and as I speak, I can see little thank yous and responses popping up in the chat. Thanks to everyone for being part of tonight's event, from the PHA, from RHSV, and of course as part of History Month 2020. To echo Andrew's thanks, thank you to Andrew as co-host, and for posing those questions so kindly and with such insight into historical research. Again, to Michelle Bashter, who put this event together alongside Charlotte Jenkins and of course Rosemary Cameron, and Kim Ma, always wonderful with the technical support behind the scenes. We look forward to seeing all of you at other PHA, RHSV and History Month events. Thank you and good night.